patient, the healing process beyond conventional Western medicine. Over to you, Lalit.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. All right. So first of all, thank you to both the Alumni Association and the Medical Humanities unit for having me here. It's obviously great to be back. You know, it looked really different when I was here as a student, right? And yeah, I can make the claim to be 100% Johnite. Yeah, 41 years ago, I was born in the third floor OT, right, as a result of a collaboration between batches of 65 and 71, right? I joined batch of 2001 over here. I then did my bond at the Tribal Health Initiative, which I understand is one of the more popular bond centers. I actually remember during internship actually going and filling out the application to make it a bond center. A year after I finished my bond, I was accepted into a PhD program in anthropology at Syracuse University, and you'll find out in the story why I chose that place. While it was a PhD program, I exited the program because I decided I don't want to be a professor of anthropology, I want to be a professor of medicine, right? Essentially, I exited with a master's and I joined internal medicine training at a pretty special program in the Bronx in New York. You know, the Bronx is one of the poorest urban districts in the United States. And I trained at the primary care social medicine program there. And by this time, I've become quite convinced that the thing I really love doing is talking to medical students. So I did a one-year medical education fellowship at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and that's where I've been since. So I've kind of been on faculty for about 7 years now. All right. That's who I spend my time with. That's my wife and kids. She's also faculty at George Washington, and was also the reason I applied to Syracuse. At the end of my bond, I met an Indian-American medical student who had actually come because her family was from the same area as the bond. And then when I went to Syracuse, obviously our relationship continued and has continued since then. So if you want one more reason to do the bond, it might be that.
Good one.
All right, no disclosures except that I'm incredibly biased about everyone here. Okay. So this is not really an anthropological insight, but I thought, just to kind of get us started, most of us, especially if you're coming out of clinic today, you're thinking in a very sort of like scientific way, you're thinking in linear, predictable sort of terms, models, p-values and stuff like that. That does not sort of fly in anthropology, right? One of the key insights which I think set me off on my intellectual journey was this whole idea that the human body is not an intricate watch system, right? Like the Frankenstein cannot be created. We can't just put together a whole bunch of parts and actually create a human, right? And around the same time that I was here, like in the early 2000s, there was this word systems. Like medical students are of course used to systems because you have the reproductive system and the genital, all of the respiratory, cardiac, right? But when you think about systems in a more broader context, what it really means is anything which sort of emerges and self-evolves by itself, predominantly through feedback loops. So for example, you can say like if you organize a human body, then there's an emergent property which comes out of it, which is the mind, right? And it's very hard to understand the mind as a complicated watch, right? So kind of one of these things is that systems are non-linear. The reason why a whirlpool is the picture there is because a whirlpool is actually a good metaphor for the way systems are created and regulated. As in, if you think of a body of water with just the water, stationary, there's a lot of Brownian movement, the molecules are going all over, there's chaos, right? And then if you open a plug at the bottom of that pool, all of a sudden this really perfect geometrical shape arises, right? And how did that arise out of this chaos, right? So really a lot of systems thinking is, when the conditions are right in chaos, like self-organizing systems emerge, right? And they sort of reproduce and die, and that the human system or the human individual and society at large is more like the whirlpool and less like the watch. So the other thing which sort of inspired me when I was still here at St. John's. I knew the story when I was still here. It's this whole concept of social medicine. I know you know preventive and social medicine, and you wondered why there are these two disciplines. And the way I like to think of it is like the history of it. So Rudolf Virchow hopefully is familiar to most of you all. The work of triad, work of nodes, so on and so forth. He was pretty much, I think, like one of the most brilliant physicians historically. And there was a time when he was, in his prime, he's very well respected. There was a huge typhus outbreak in a part of Germany called Silesia, right? So they sent this guy off, like they would do even today. They sent an expert commission to there. And what they were really expecting him to say is like, well, this vector or this, we need to spray this, pesticide or something like that. But by that time in his life, he had sort of become, his thinking was involving more from just pure science to like anthropology. And really when he went there, his conclusion was that the reason there was so much of scrub typhus was because the bureaucracy would not help the people. The feudal aristocracy was using its money to indulge in the luxury and the follies of the court. The plutocracy, which probably means the rich, did not recognize upper Silesians as human beings, and the clerical hierarchy endorsed the wretched meanness of the people as a ticket to heaven, right? And then his prescription was that there needs to be full and unlimited democracy, as in that each of these institutions, right, needed to have upper Silesians running them, right, which was not the case at that time. And really, like one of the sort of best illustrations of this point is actually our own experiment with democracy, right? Full and unlimited. If you really look at the life expectancy in India, where the slope takes off is not where we gain independence. That's around the 1920s and 30s. And by no means is independence the only thing driving the slope. It's advent of antibiotics, sanitation and hygiene, so on and so forth. But you can kind of see even in this like little bump and take off from independence. And you can think of, as a thought experiment, like British colonial rule, going forward, this curve would not have been as steep, right? So this whole idea that, gosh, those guys who were freedom fighters, my granddad was actually a general in the Indian National Army, with Subhash Chandra Bose. He actually was one of the most effective public health people, of his time. Not all the guys in the, Calcutta School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who were hoping to be the agents of this curve, but perhaps were not, right? And then the third thing which I think struck me as something which I like doing, right, was this whole concept of hanging out as a research methodology. I once, just like you guys, attended a talk by an anthropologist. I forget actually honestly the exact content of his thought, but when he was trying to dumb it down for medical students, he said that basically I go and hang out. And I was like, I do that all the time and I love it, so I tell me more. And really, if you think about like how this methodology came about, if you think of like when anthropology was born, right, this is around the time in which like colonial empires were growing. So there's the British colonial empire, the Spanish, the French, so on and so forth, right? And in all of these empires, like sailors, adventurers, businessmen, so on and so, would find curious artifacts or often steal curious artifacts, from wherever they were and bring them back to the center, to London, and Oxford and Cambridge and all of those places. And out of that, they grew area experts, right? So if you think of the British Museum, that's the picture on the left, there's the Room of Egypt, which has all of these mummies. And then the idea of the expert was like, by studying these objects, by reading these ancient texts, like we are now the expert on Egypt, right? Around that time, a budding anthropologist called Malinowski was actually stranded in the Pacific on something called the Trobriand Islands, right, during World War I. Essentially, they were like, they're not going to come and pick up an anthropologist in the middle of a war, so just hang tight, right? And as a result, for the first time, someone who was, not a sailor or an adventurer, but someone who was actually a scholar, started writing about these people. And the depth of his insight, not surprisingly, when we think about it right now, was far, far greater than anyone just studying the objects, So later on, like anyone who just claimed to be the expert by just knowing the objects but never having talked to or visited or hung out with the people, right? that was no longer like acceptable. Like the rigor had moved in the discipline. And when we say hanging out, like what do we actually mean? We mean is like being embedded and integrated into the social lives of whoever you seek to study or understand, right? So for example, all of y'all in a way are sort of doing an ethnography of medical education in India, right? Because all of y'all maybe, whenever, before y'all joined, really didn't know anything about medical school culture, right? And now y'all are, in-depth informants of this culture, and you would be able to write a much more in-depth sort of thing compared to, say, someone in America who's just seen like 10,000 pictures of St. John's, Yeah. What did this go for?
This ran ahead of
Move forward.
Okay. Sorry, did I give it away? Oh, it's going the other way. Sorry about that. Oh, here we are, right? So, so that's Malinowski hanging out with the Trobriand Islanders. And so my first field site, as I say, was Wor Theingi, and this was like my sort of attempt at this. I came from a sort of very anglicized household, but I'm half Tamil, and part of the reason of going there was I wanted to understand Tamil, and the best way to learn any language is through this process called immersion. You just go to some place where nobody speaks anything but that, right? That's why like everyone who comes to medical school and who doesn't speak great English by first year is great at speaking English by 4th or 5th year, right? Because everyone speaks it over here. Yeah, and while I was there, like I suddenly started getting so much of insight. Like I remember, like in my, I was pretty much, there were 3 doctors. There were 2 senior doctors and me, so they would often just leave me with this 24-bed hospital, right? And we would get like patients at any time of the day and night, and we would kind of get a recurring patient. It's like a younger woman with like acute abdominal pain. So of course we are well trained at St. John's. Differential diagnosis, upper quadrant, lower quadrant, so on and so forth. We can list them all out. But the difference over here was number one. This is a village of 3,000 people. So when I finished clinic, essentially because nothing else to do, like you would be somewhere around the village. So almost everyone, at least, there were people coming from far away too, but, you kind of got a sense, like people would see you later and be like, oh yeah, I picked up that medicine or something like that. And everyone who worked there was married to someone in the village, right, and lived in the village frequently. So it was a kind of like a much more total sort of way of understanding. And like in any other like hospital, these staff were sort of my interpreters. And once they pulled me aside and said, this is one woman, and we're pretty sure what's happening is every time her husband gets drunk, he's drinking at the liquor shop because it's a small village. Word has got back to her that he's drunk, right? And when he's drunk, she knows he's going to beat her badly, right? And maybe just in the stress of the whole thing, she develops this acute abdominal pain, she's not necessarily, faking it, right? And of course, neighbors are concerned, the husband is now chastised or being drunk when your wife is sick, wife comes to the hospital. Essentially what it is, it's safe for the night. So once I kind of understood the dynamic of this one or 2 particular women, like I just realized like, well, the easiest thing is put them on an IV overnight, they'll be good in the morning, right? But what really showed me is like, gosh, that differential diagnosis, which I was very proud of, was perhaps inadequate, and this hanging out way really kind of had some potential to it, right? And I sort of, at that point in time, was a lot into poetry and writing my own poems, which I won't put up here. But like one of my favorite ones is sort of pretty much the same theme. And when they say like, when you visit us, our clothes are ripped and torn, and you listen over our naked body as to the cause of our illness. A glance at our rag will be more revealing. The one and the same cause wears out our body and our clothes. It's a word called bread. So I had a pretty sort of voracious reading habit, and around that time I started picking up books which suddenly were making these exact same connections that I was sort of making between poverty, between why people were poor, jobs moving to cities, there was migration, there were, young men who were no longer able to be with their young wives, because they were forced to work in the city. There was all sorts of these connections, and I started noticing that a lot of these people who were, sorry, this thing going the wrong way. A lot of these people who seemed to be, making sense to me were medical anthropologists. Right? And what I was drawn to was like, yes, I could, almost the reason why I was doing poetry was because it was so hard to write about these things because you didn't know anything about like the language to write. Right? I'm used to like writing like you guys, like I can summarize, cute abdomen, like 23-year-old woman, but how do I actually write about poverty? How do I make these connections? And there was what I realized, there was a whole sort of like what is now kind of referred to as like an extra clinical language. A way to talk about human beings and society which is not situated within the medical professions and which you won't hear if you're exclusively in a medical environment, right? And what I then realized that medical anthropology is actually part of a much huger thing, right? Which is actually anthropology, right? Anthropology is sort of defined a little differently country by country, right? In the US, which is where I trained, anthropology involves 4 sort of related fields, right? So the first field is the study of man before man started writing down things, right? So the only evidence we have is the buildings and the structures that they left behind. So what can you say about a particular society, for example, based on the stuff they left behind? For example, you guys know the Indus civilization, Harappa, so on and so forth. If you notice in the Indus civilization, there are no palaces. Like what we might conclude then is like something about the hierarchy of their governance systems, right? At the same time, you didn't just find ruins, you found skeletons because bones keep, right? So there was a second field which was interpreting the bones, and the reason these are 2 different fields is just because the body of knowledge is completely different. Biological anthropologists are fantastic anatomists, and actually that field came out of anatomy. So when I was studying that, just to kind of give you an example, the person who was teaching us, the introductory course was this woman who had spent her PhD days sitting in an emergency room in Britain, right? Paying attention to all the women who had been injured through domestic violence, and paying attention to what was happening to their bones, what kinds of fractures are produced, what kind of trauma. And then once you kind of get an idea like this, you can look through skeletal remains from, wherever you name it. Like she was looking at a site in the Czech Republic, often what happens is, a mass grave is found from, some long forgotten time, and then biological anthropologists are called in. And then you could write about violence in the women, like by documented gut, like, half these women have these fractures, or maybe less than 1% have this. So this idea of telling the story of human beings, in times in which human beings are not telling their own story, right? Like the thing which is missing here is history, like or his story, which is, once people start writing things down, that's more efficient than trying to figure it out from like whether they consider the palace or not, right? But cultural anthropology was a sort of unholy mishmash of everything else. In fact, when I tell people I'm an anthropologist, most people presume I'm a biological anthropologist, because that would probably be the most sensible thing to do, because you can really use your training. But I'm not, like, it's cultural anthropology. And these books, really, I was not studying for any exams at this point in time. The reason being was, like, even at this point in time, I was pretty convinced I was going to do public health, and I was pretty convinced I was going to do an MPH abroad, But at the end of this, I actually just wrote to the woman on the left, Cecilia Van Hollen, right? And her book, Birth and the Threshold, was writing about the fact that around that time, like, Tamil Nadu had achieved the highest level of institutionalized deliveries. I think there's a government target of like 95% of births are in the hospital, so on so forth. So basically what had happened was this huge society change, in which everyone had, number one, seen birth happening, because when births happen in villages, if you're married, you can kind of come and be in the room, so to speak, right? And there was a whole, cadre of like dyes and all of that, and all of this society was sort of getting like jumbled and reorganized, and what did that mean, right? Very hard for us to predict right now because we are not hanging out with women like that, right? But if we were, then we would have more insight into that, and that was exactly what her book was about. Paul Farmer, he was one of the greats in anthropology. I would say, if you are going to read anthropology, start with him. He actually passed away last year, but actually just a few weeks before his death, I actually got the opportunity to co-teach with him in a project in Rwanda, which I actually really feel blessed for. But with Dr. Cecilia Van Hollen, I just wrote to her saying, hey, I'm one of those doctors doing these deliveries. Like, I've already done like 500 in my Bonn Center. And here's what I think, and as the inserted perspective from you've been hanging out with women, you haven't really been hanging out with doctors, and here's my take on this. And long story short, I got offered a PhD position with what they call a teaching assistantship. So you get your fees waived and you get a living stipend in exchange for you study as a PhD student, and then you teach or you help the professors teach the basic or junior classes, right? So a year after meeting my now wife in Siddhalingi, in Dharmapuri district, I sort of impressed her by suddenly showing up in her home state of New York in Syracuse for this. And one of the first things you teach when you teach these basic courses as teaching is this sort of concept of cultural relativism, right? And basically what cultural relativism says, if you want to understand someone, right, you have to understand the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly from their perspective, and not from your perspective. For example, you might go and see someone scantily clad somewhere and then just assume that someone who's scantily clad is sexually promiscuous, right? Because in your culture and understanding, that's the link, right? But maybe not so, maybe from their understanding, that's not a link that culture makes, So this sort of idea, is a very sort of uneasy idea because it then sort of kind of takes away this sort of moral high ground. There's not one right way of doing things. Is informed consent the only way and the only, when we say, do you have to do informed consent before you do a procedure, right? If you were in the West, you would say 100%, right? But in the practicalities, the Indian context, sometimes it's just impossible to inform someone at the degree in which it is expected in your medical ethics textbook, right? So, does that mean that we judge and say everything out here is unethical, right? Or do we say maybe there is a different ethic over here, right? And then we have to figure out that ethic, again, partly from the doctors, but also partly from the patients. Because all patients, maybe a universal thing is, they know a good doctor when they see a good doctor, right? And maybe the good doctor is not doing informed consent, but they can explain why they still see. And this really kind of brings us to in any understanding, there's the ethic perspective and the emic perspective, right? And the ethic is that outsider perspective. Now, I'm not saying the outsider perspective is not useful, It sometimes is actually very useful. Sometimes when people come from elsewhere and study things which are very familiar to us, they see things which perhaps we are not seeing because we are just so used to it. If you go abroad, you kind of have the same thing. You start noticing things which people there had really not paid attention to. But it's also important to have the emic perspective, right? And with the title of the talk being Learning English Medicine, I always find that is a great sort of example of ethic and emic, right? So if you think of the ethic perspective of how biomedicine is understood in India, you would never hear the term English medicine, right? It's biomedicine or Western medicine or scientific medicine or so on, things like that, right? But if you actually look at the cultural understanding of what we are all doing here right now, it's like Angrezi Dawai, right? It's English medicine, right? And to fully understand medicine in India, you have to see the ethic perspective, but you also have to understand why do they exactly call this? What are the historical origins of this? So on and so forth. Now, anthropology for a long time has been sort of associated with this idea that we are interested in the primitive people, right? Really, we are interested in interesting people, right? And one of the kind of big changes in anthropology is this sort of thought of like the anthropology of the below, right, versus anthropology of above. Studying people who are more powerful than the anthropologists versus people who are less powerful than the anthropologists. So, for example, if an anthropologist is hanging out in an OR, studying OR culture and writing about surgeons, right? Surgeons, if they get really upset about the person writing, do have the sort of capacity to shut him down at the university level, right? So there is even in terms of methodology, a sort of different approach, right? And you also like the way you question, because like these people will read your thesis and so on and so forth, right? But it was also becoming more and more apparent that it is more important for us as a human race to understand the above than the below, right? It's more understand what's going on in the head if someone's doing a $600 million wedding. What are the values and beliefs of that, what's going on in a family like that, right? So this anthropology of biomedicine was kind of born out of that, in which initially anthropologists saw clinicians as fellow researchers. And now anthropologists saw clinicians as an object of study in themselves. So when you study, medicine, they will actually say that medicine is this sort of like culture of no culture. People will say everything is scientific in medicine. There's nothing we just dumbly believe, right? But actually, if you think about it, there's lots in medicine in which there's no scientific proof that the mind is different from the body. It's just that our starting assumption, right, of everything we build upon is the mind is separate from the body. So if an anthropologist was hanging out in St.John, they would notice, there's a department of neurology and a department of psychiatry, and that would be evidence, and you kind of see, are these departments really closely interlinked with each other and working like hand in hand, or perhaps not, right? So here are some of the other things. If someone had to say, like, just as we are very easy to say in other systems of medicine. Yeah, Ayurveda, they believe in dosha and balance and all of that, and like acupuncture believes in chi and meridian lines and all that. What do we believe in? So like we believe that nature is separate from the supernatural, right? And when I say supernatural, I don't mean like demons and pishachi, I mean like love, right? Like there's something like intangible which is separate. Like love is separate from nature, right? And nature is separate from the human consciousness, although humans are part of nature, right? And culture is separate from nature, right? All of these things, there's no scientific proof that culture is separate from nature, or, same way the individual patient is the appropriate unit of analysis and not the family or the community, right? There's sometimes pushback in like family therapy and some of the sort of therapeutic fields, that disease and physiological processes are universal and freed from the particularities of the individual. This allows us to run clinical trials, right? Because actually, if you pay attention now, most clinical trials are being run in India, right? So like all of these new drugs which are getting FDA approved for the US are not actually being, trialed in the US, only because the US does not have that volume of patients, right? Especially for some of these rarer conditions. Like you can round up like 100 multiple sclerosis patients pretty easily in Bangalore compared to, Washington, which is like much less populated. So, but the idea is like it's transferable, right? For example, in Ayurveda, that's completely nonsense. It's like there's this concept of what we call local biology. So there'll be like, these medicines won't work on those people because they're not Indian. Like they have like a different biology, right? Which you can see there's some truth to it, and obviously it's very useful to think of, us as universal. I'm not saying that these beliefs, are to be critiqued or you should stop believing them. I'm just saying that they are beliefs and not research conclusions, right? And they are tremendously useful because everything we do in medicine is built up on this. Also, the other way of looking at medicine is like, well, what are the things medicine has done in India, right? And among the things medicine has done in India, and this medical college is a clear sort of result of that, is Christian evangelism. Like if you look at the history of evangelism in India, like people are coming and preaching with not a lot of success, But once people, now from the imic perspective of the Catholics, what they would really say is through the example of showing people the love of Jesus Christ by caring for their sick and their wounded, we have drawn them to us. That's the emic perspective, right? It's like you would understand it like that, and that's true, But there's an ethic perspective too. Like as a result, people were sometimes also making practical choices, of engaging with the church because it was life-saving, Similarly with colonialism in general, capitalism, so on and so forth. So there are lots of studies about this, and I sort of, because I love teaching, kind of started getting a little bit more interested in one small little subset of biomedicine, which is the training of doctors. Remember, biomedicine is not the training of doctors, it's nurses and radiologists and public health and so on and so forth, right? And to kind of bring us to this question of like, why are the way we are in the US, in India, it's sometimes useful to start with the history, right? So if you think of like when biomedicine actually first showed up as medical education, like these are doctors trained here. It was in like 1922 when the British suddenly realized like they can't just rely on a supply of doctors from abroad, that they had to train the natives, so to speak, right? And when you do that, you assign some guy, who's got no roadmap, right? He doesn't know how to, clearly these people are not English-speaking Londoners, so you kind of have to do it a little differently. So they do it in the most practical and commonsensical way. I mean, we're like, well, we can't teach them in English. None of them speak it, right? So we have to translate every single medical textbook into Urdu and Bengali, right? And then remember, this is, biomedicine in the 18th century, so we are still in Mercury and Leach's stage, and a little bit of penicillin was kind of coming down the line. So we realized, like, gosh, we don't really have the answers. Like some of these things, yeah, like we've seen it abroad, like we kind of know all about it. Other things we've never seen, So Unani and Ayurveda were sort of said as like, well, any practitioner needs to know all three, And then, values and beliefs started changing very, very quickly, actually, after, sorry, that should be 1822, that should be 1822, sorry. That very much later, the Committee of Native Medical Education, so, they had 10 years of this, like any good sort of government entity after 10 years, like, where's the report, And the report actually said, bad idea to do it in Bengali and Urdu, right? And the reason being put forth was that there is no way that we can continue this project of translating everything, right? We can translate core texts, but scientific medicine is also taking off in the West, so there's a lot of stuff coming down the line. Ronald Ross is sitting in Hyderabad, like discovering malaria, so on and so forth, right? So they recommended English, not in the hope that they write books, good or bad, right? And this was one of the main objections. Well, how can you expect them to write scientific reports, because they were expecting Indian doctors to be just like the to the British doctors, that, you would write back scientific reports like Ronald Ross style and like all of these things. And like, how can you expect these people, even if they spoke English, to write English, as you know, in any language, it's a much higher degree of fluency. And they said, we don't want them to write. We want them just to digest, right? So if you're wondering why Indian physicians, even till today, if you look at like research publications from even top institutions like this, it actually has its historical underpinnings over here, right? So, Macaulay, famous character, who's kind of arch villain of this whole era, wanted to produce a caste of people, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. And I think if he saw this room, he would kind of approve, And so subsequently, Native Medical Institution with his multi-system, and that's the reason why none of us really know a lot about Ayurveda or Unani, So it was these kind of things which were sort of interesting me and exciting me. And, I'm kind of, because anthropology is so big, I said, like, let's just kind of work through, like, one anthropology problem, right? And the problem is to do with, like, language and the doctor-patient relationship, right? And the reason I became interested in it, because I came in a very anglicized household, and the easy way to explain that is I had 3 of my grandparents alive, but never once in their entire lives have I spoken to them in any language but English, right? At the grandmother level, not my parents' level, right? So I think there is a whole generation of people who are that, but I think they're still kids now, in which their grandmas exclusively talk to them in English, but I was perhaps just a generation early, So if you look historically again at the patient and the doctor, the historical term was bedside manner, right? And what does bedside manner mean? Bedside manner is you only pay attention to the doctor. You can demonstrate bedside manner without an actual patient in front of you. You can just like mime it. Oh, hello, how are you, sir? Like, I'm polite and this and that. I'm great bedside manner. Oh, he doesn't know how to talk. Like, he doesn't have bedside manner. And then very shortly, actually, after Indian medicine and British medicine cleaved in the 1960s, there was a sort of like a sea change in British medicine and very quickly European and American medicine, because all of those systems are sort of interconnected. Like scholars, British scholars will read German, Germans read American, so on and so forth, right? Then Michael and Enid Ballant were two psychologists who started saying, sometimes the problems in a particular relationship or why we're not understanding something, if the doctor is not understanding the patient something, it's not got to do with the bedside manner of the doctor, but really the relationship or the space in between them, right? Which is what we now just call the doctor-patient relationship, and we sometimes assume that people always had this concept or idea or value or belief, depending on what you call it, right? And around that time, if you're interested in the doctor-patient relationship, it was also the 1960s, the start of video technology, right? So essentially what doctors were doing is they were videoing, encounters with real patients, right? Especially encounters which you just felt like, I'm getting really frustrated because, this person with diabetes comes and every time, like her sugar is 400 and A1C is 12 and I don't know what's going on and I tell her really nicely and you're like, okay, let's video you telling her really nicely, and see what's going on, And out of that, a lot of things emerge, like, for example, like medicine at that point in time was very patriarchal, like this was a lot of men, there were people who were using this, most notably the feminist movement, to demand certain things from doctors, like informed consent, right? Informed consent like came out of this, when videos were taken of what the surgeon told the patient before the operation, people were like, hold up, that was far too little, right? You didn't really tell them that they would possibly die, that they would never come under anesthesia. So there were standards set, right? And if you really think about it, like how the standard would have been set is the senior most doctors, the profs of medicine or whatever, who would be sort of like setting the standard, so to speak. It would be their practice. Here's how I approach this patient. It's kind of, Now, if you did the same thing in India, like the first thing you would do with all of these videos is you wouldn't be able to understand all the videos, because even in a place like this, if you started videoing a single professor of medicine, seeing all the patients in his OPD clinic, right? The first thing you notice is like, oh, it's going to be very different based on the languages of the patient, right? And linguistic anthropology, you remember that branch, which I didn't really talk a lot about, can kind of like explain like why, Tamil and Malayalam are similar to each other, and like why they're so different from Hindi, and like, all of these families of languages, and you can really get into the history and the culture of language to understand the mix, But what you realize is if you kind of had to simplify it, there are people who are linguistically and culturally concordant to us. So think of like an English-speaking, college-educated person, whereas it's easiest for us to treat, right? Because I can explain things like how I would explain to myself almost, right? And someone who's uneducated and does not speak the language I'm speaking is the hardest person to think. Not because they're stupid, right? It's only because like I don't really have a connection with you, starting with the prerequisite, which is language, but even if you have that language connection, like sometimes it's just your understanding of everything in this world is so different from mine that I don't understand your unique perspective, So actually in 2007 with Dr. Nachikesh Shankar, we actually did a small project. This coincided with RGUHS saying, oh, all medical schools have to have a 20-hour Kannada curriculum, right? So we actually like did some survey work. So here was the preference. Not surprisingly, all the students speak English, right? If you see that they don't to 100, it doesn't add up to 100 because people obviously speak more than one language. Like more people, okay, it's 2017, you guys can tell me whether it's the same or slightly different. You know, most people speak Hindi, you know, Kannada, again, this is just people self-reporting. So when you say I speak Kannada, it could mean a lot of things, right? But it's, even when it could mean a lot of things, people are like, no, I don't speak it, you know. And then Bengali, you know, and the reason we asked about Bengali is at the same time we just did a one-day cross-section, you know, of the inpatient thing, and here's what we found, right? So 50% Kannada speaking. Like, do you guys think this is close to reality now, or is it a very different? You'll be like, no, there's not that many Tamil and Telugu. It's pretty much the same. Oh, okay, so great. One day in 2017 was sort of representative of the rest of the days, right? And yeah, about two-thirds of patients speak 2 languages, right? Almost nobody said I speak 3 languages, like very small, 1 or 2%, right? But 1/3 just spoke one of those languages, right? And it's like when you know, I use this part of the slide sometimes when I'm with a non-Indian sort of audience to say like, no, these are not dialects of the same language. These are completely different languages and scripts, right? You know, it's like you can't, you know, if you know one, you don't know the others. And this is the problem, right? Like, you know, that there is a complete discordance, right? But for some reason, that discordance is being missed, right? Because it's an image discordance, right? Like, if you actually talk about, if you sat in London and read everything which was coming out of India, every single publication, you kind of would not pick up on this problem. The only way you would pick up on this problem is you came and hung out, right? Or you did statistics, but you know, hanging out would have been at least to do the hypothesis. You know, and of course this has some sort of significant effects, you know, so if you were to kind of think of just language discordance, you're not talking about cultural discordance because that's harder to study and find, right? Obviously, the first thing is that anyone who doesn't speak the language, let's assume like we're all in France for the Olympics, you know, one of us falls sick. Are you really going to go and try and speak to a French doctor, or are you going to be like, no, I really want to kind of avoid it, right? If you did go and speak to that French doctor, it's very likely that, you know, that French doctor might not really get what you're saying. You know, there might be some meaning. You probably know a little bit of English. You know, they kind of be the same experience as some of the Telugu patients or Bengali patients have here. You know, like there's a lot of hand waving and probably some extra CT scans. And then, of course, you know, you might actually remarkably get correctly diagnosed and prescribed treatment which you didn't understand, right? So, you know, these would be the sort of 3 sort of main effects. And also, one of the things we did survey in that initial survey was we just asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, how, and we didn't say like which language, just like you have a language ability, right? With your existing language ability, what do you find difficult, right? So no surprise, if you were to read these graphs, red is bad, green is good, right? So no surprise, explaining a diagnosis to the patient is the hardest thing for any Johnite medical student, right? The second hardest is actually recording the histories, right? Interestingly, we found this leadership role thing, that if you came in and you felt, like lots of people sit here, and I'm sure someone in the audience who feel like, gosh, if I just had other language skills, I would shine more as a leader. I would be able to take, you know, like I would be able to show off or you know, show competence a little bit more. And the good news about that is, if it's English competence, you will all reach it. You know, it'll just take a little time, so be patient if you're there. But even understanding lecture, studying medical text, English, written exams and oral exams seem to be the easiest to do. You know, so you would actually sometimes flip it if it was an Indian language. I'm sure it's easier for us to speak Indian languages, but English is sometimes more, you know, easy to write. Because also, people who haven't learned it from society, more from school, they've learned it in that way, like all of us have learned some second language. It was very heavy on the writing and very light on the speaking. So, to kind of come to the problem, you know, if you had to look in the US, I teach medical students in the US, and you know, we teach them from the first day. We teach them in small groups, and they basically, I have a small group for a year and a half, you know, and then they graduate, and I have another small group for a year and a half. And we spend hours talking to these English speakers who are speaking to English speakers on how to ask them questions in English. How do you frame asking a sexual history? You know, how do you frame asking a sexual history to a teenager versus an 80-year-old, right? In terms of language, you know, what are the words which can be used, what are the words which can't be used, so on and so forth. And based on that, we have an assessment technique called a standardized patient interview. This is the famous USMLE Step 2 CS, which is now no longer there, right? Interestingly, Step 2 CS has a 99% pass rate for Americans and a 50% pass rate for Indians. So if we had to think of the standard patient interview, we have to always set with the gold standard, right? So, what would be the gold standard if there is someone who is linguistically, culturally discordant, right? Because there are Bengali speaking people, largely from Bangladesh and not from India, who only speak Bengali in New York, for sure, especially the old grandmas, So they have the same problem as St. John's, in other words, right? But, so if the professor of medicine met this Bengali patient, what is the gold standard? What's the pass in the exam for how this person should treat the other person, right? So, there's a very long history actually linked to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and that whole thing, which I won't get into detail, but basically it's written into US law that you can't discriminate on someone based on nationality, and courts have now interpreted nationality as language ability. So, if in that service that Bengali patient was getting a lesser service, right, than the English-speaking patient, then they can do that great American quality improvement exercise, which is sue them. And lawyers quickly realize and make the calculation is like, gosh, we have so many patients and they all sue us, it's going to be 50 million, so let's spend 20 million on interpreters. It's that sort of calculus. They haven't created an interpreter program out of goodness of their heart, right? It was the goodness of the civil rights movement, right? But I don't even think Martin Luther King was thinking about Bengali patients in New York, right? It was just like a beautiful kind of unfolding legacy from that. So really what they do, and this is what I do in my clinic too, if there was a Bengali patient, is you use an interpreter, right? And you're trained in the use of an interpreter, and there are even standardized patient interviews in which for example, if the medical student just keeps talking to the interpreter and not to the student, you're failed, right? I'm not to the student, to the patient, you fail. If you're talking to the patient and the interpreter's on the side, you pass. This is the gold standard, right? So, what would that gold standard look like in India? Is the gold standard no, we just have to do the US thing and we should get on the job with this interpreter? It's a billions of dollars industry over there. So if you have to think about that, it gets a little bit more complicated in India, right? Because you obviously have the university requirements, and then you have the requirements of this hospital. So great, I'm going to train all you guys to speak Kannada. If I'm very ambitious, I'll try and teach some of the other languages. But this person is not even from here. This person is from Gujarat, right? As soon as they finish MBBS, they're intending not to live in Bangalore for the rest of their life. They are intending to live in Gujarat. So we have this additional thing that the long-term individual professional needs of doctors are sometimes not addressed at the teaching side, and there's that great degree of uncertainty, right? Almost all of y'all, thanks to PG and jobs and so on, so will kind of cycle through a couple of states, and even if you're in the same state, you'll cycle through a couple of language mixes, right? So it's this kind of idea of lifelong learning. Right? So, if you have to think of this, what comes down to is really what the patient thinks is the gold standard and what the doctor thinks is the gold standard. Currently in India, the acceptable standard, I would be hesitant to call the gold standard, is if you can't understand what I'm saying, sucks to be you. If it's we just can't help it. Is the kind of goal standard. But sometimes what is really important to ask is how do patients see good doctors? And honestly, I don't know the answer to how do patients see if the doctor cannot speak my language, which happens all the time, right? Ideally, pass in the exam ideally, this is what he should do, right? And then there's the other perspective of if the doctor does not speak the language, ideally from our side, because remember, we are concerned about getting the HPI and so on and so forth. That patient not exactly concerned about that, right? So Cecilia Van Hollen, who I studied with, actually did try and answer that in a different context, which is She was hanging out, this was after I met her, in fact I facilitated this interaction, in the Cancer Institute in Chennai, right? And when you hang out with the patients and you kind of, they kind of break the ice, she speaks fluent Tamil, right? So like any Indian, like as soon as you meet someone not Indian but speaks Indian languages, people will kind of, fall for them, so to speak. So she realized that actually, of course they knew who the good doctors and the bad doctors. But unlike the US, when they say like the bad doctors don't tell the people they have cancer, the good doctors tell the people they have cancer. They're like, no, bad doctors tell the people they have cancer or may not, and good doctors do the same. The difference is that the bad doctor is telling us and not telling us with no understanding of who the patient is. The good doctor is making that call, right, based on his in-depth understanding of the family or social dynamics around that patient. So he's making an individual call saying, yes, this Ajit, yeah, I get with her family dynamic, her last days, often these are terminally ill people, will be better without the cancer diagnosis. And this Ajit who's here, would be better with the cancer diagnosis. And really, the thing was not about, like, they didn't all feel bad that they were not informed. Which would be the sort of ethic perspective from, the US, if you kind of have a US ethicist kind of come down here. So, if you have to pick on the doctor side, yes, you can ask the good doctors, but also, if you look at the medical profession, like anthropologically or sociology, the medical profession standards are set, through a very sort of rigorous and legal process. I kind of looked for the new National Medical Commission sort of guideline documents. There are so many documents, I can't find the right ones, but I know from 2018, when the old and now dead MCI, had something called HCOM, which is Attitudes, Ethics, and Communication. And in the entire 80 page, if you search, just do they mention the word language? They mention it once, right? And what they say is the standard in India is that you must be able to demonstrate, so that means by final MBBS, right? The ability to communicate adequately, sensitively, effectively, and respectfully with patients in a language that the patient understands and in a manner that will improve the patient's satisfaction. Now, if you think about it, how is that even possible, right? It is, now people will be like, well, you should just, every time you go to the, you just learn the local language. That's biologically impossible. That's like saying, all doctors above 40 should run the mile in 4 minutes. Maybe 5% of the people can do that, right? But it's just not biologically possible. And if you understand language learning, it's kind of very interesting because all of the other learning you're doing in medical school, you're situated in one part of your cortex, which as a 20-year-old you're primed, to learn. Like your neurodevelopment is now fully adult, by the time you're 20, 21, your brain is ready for med school. That's why we don't train 15-year-olds, it's not that they're not some smart 15-year-olds who can do anatomy. It's just like neurobiologically they're not, and socially they're not there. So y'all are primate. Y'all are not as a primate to do language. That kind of ship has sailed, right? The reason being is people have the it's kind of two things. One is just the biology, the neuroplasticity of the brain. It's very hard. It's easy to, it's easy to do, for example, learn gymnastics when you're a kid. You can't learn gymnastics at your age to that level, right? So it's not just language, right? The other thing is kids socially are not trained to shut off when the language is not theirs. Right? If you're in a bus and everyone's speaking a different language, your brain will just automatically shut out all of the audio streams which are not in the language, of your own. It's just, even if you're tried, I'm really going to pay attention to every language and sound that these guys are making, it's really hard, to unlearn that social behavior. Whereas kids are just wrapped in attention to every sound coming their way, right? Because that's how they learn their primary language. So they learn it at a different way. So it's not possible just to say, just learn the language and demonstrate it, right? So, how might you sort of get through this? I don't really have an answer, but this is what I would say is like a potential for anthropology, and an anthropological approach to come to this. So I'll sort of end it over there. I know I did a tight hour, but I'm happy to stay longer for questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's
been fascinating listening to you, Lalit. I would like to hear from the medical students. Have you had any myths broken just listening to him? Do you have any thoughts and questions?
Are we going to have a second anthropologist from John's?
Or demand for some anthropology within your curriculum?
Personally, one thing that you shared really resonated. I think at the PHI, like the St.John hospital, you spoke about that patient, right, and how the diagnosis was totally different. I think that's actually true. Like when you spend so much time, like maybe it's not just in the clinical setting or at an OP interaction. When you spend time with the patient, you realize there's a lot more factors that's actually affecting them. And I think having that extra time makes a huge difference, and understanding their family background and all, and why they did certain things. Because even like a lot of, I'm speaking from a pediatric perspective, so even recently in my postings, I noticed there were 3 children who had chronic cough, and they were actually being bullied really badly by their batchmates, and they stopped attending classes for 5 months. And this was we only came to know this on the 7th or 8th day when we were about to discharge them, and then we realized, okay, we can intervene, we can write a letter saying that, see, this is happening at the school, kindly look into this. So that's something that we did, but until we had that proper conversations with the family and the background, we wouldn't even know the child is not attending classes because of the social situation occurring at, back at the school. So yeah.
No, that's a great example. If I might make a little suggestion, I used to do this, and I don't know if it's technically possible right now. It's like, like when you want to present a patient, you go see the patient, but then there's that hang time before your doctor comes to it. Like, don't go and sit away from the patients. Go and sit in such a way that you're still in the ward, right? You can be reading or whatever. You will notice a lot of interesting things happening. Pay attention to how, like, after the doctor has talked to the patient, what the patient does. Often they will ask their neighbors, and they will all of these other things. So, like, yeah.
Just to add on to what Hannah said, I had the opportunity as well to go to PHI a couple of months back, and I would recommend that to everyone. It was one of the best experiences. And the concept you said of hanging out, right? It's a very foreign word to me. Maybe I remember that from your speech over here. Could you speak more about this hanging out part? Like, as you just mentioned, in the hospital after the doctor leaves, but more than that, like in the college, in the OT, or stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, frequently in the THI context, the 2 doctors there are a Malayali couple, Dr. Reddy and Lalita, right? So medical students will come and spend lots of time with them, right? But then they will leave without even speaking to a single person from that area, right? Because they're like, yeah, this ethic perspective, which, I mean, they are not really academic too, right, at that point of time, but this perspective of theirs, but, I actually learned most of my medicine, honestly, from, the staff over there, who are 8th grade pass, but can do LPs and all sorts of things, which, I knew theoretically all the layers of this and that, but how exactly to do it, they were the ones who taught me how to deliver a baby and stuff like that. So yeah, anytime you go to these sites, like, pay attention to who you're hanging out with, right? And the reason why I say hanging out and not just talking to is because there is some understanding which you will get if you're just, if you're there for a visit, obviously you can't hang out for your very limited time. But you will never get the same thing as working 2 years over there. Like, it's impossible to get the same kind of level of understanding.
Just want to add to that point. So with some of the medical students, and actually from other students from psychology who do health psychology with me, we do narrative medicine, and that involves some amount of this immersion where you are trying to understand the patient's larger context and stories by just listening and being there. So narrative medicine, I think, is not known, not really used to its potential. We are so driven by evidence-based medicine, which is generalizing information, and we're losing out on these nuances which are so important.
So is there a necessity for us as medical students in order to have a language course in our curriculum so that when we interact with patients, we have a better connect with the patients and also be able to deliver a good diagnosis to them? So do you think that is a necessity?
I mean, it is a necessity because it's an RUGHS requirement. So
but not just for the language of Kannada, for example. RGHS requires the language of Kannada. But for other languages specific to that hospital, let's say for John's, we have around 6 different languages, right? So do you think that each hospital should teach the languages of patient in flow? Because that's not a possible phrase.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked the question. It's almost like you were planned, but I know you're not. So we did, one of the other things I have done is that, out of that course, we created something called multilingual medical interviewing, right? It's like, so when you are learning history taking, is what you call it here, but medical interviewing is more in the medical education literature, is that right from the start, when the first time you're taught, this is chief complaint, HPI, past surgical history, so on and so forth, you are taught how to do it in 3 languages. Because we thought, yes, of course you'd like to do all the languages, but practically it's 3, right? 1 is in English, right? You're all taught that, right? 2 is in the majority language of the hospital, right? Because that would be the most here to be Kannada. But 3 is what we define as something called the language of the heart, right? Which is some language you have a connection to. So it might be a mother tongue, maybe you're married to someone and you're going to go to their state to work, so it might be that, it might just be a language you always wanted to learn. And I think you can, do it in 3 languages. And the way the methodology we use is like the instructor in the class. The problem is it's very hard to find a faculty member who speaks a lot of these languages, right? Kannada, yes, but some of the other ones are harder, right? Is that basically the faculty member would teach in English and then help you through the Kannada, right? And then what would happen is you would go to your original language teacher. So the fact that you had something with this language is, maybe it's your mother tongue, then you can go back, to your family or whoever thing, and say like, hey, I just learned how to ask about sexual history in Kannada and English. How do you do it in this other language? So it would be a sort of like a third self-learning component. And really like that self-learning component is often in medicine, because the course is so packed, you realize you can't actually teach everything an actual practicing doctor needs to know in these years. Because they're finite, right? Like there was complete silence when everyone said that you don't add one more thing to the curriculum with good reason. So the idea is like really like teaching people how to learn. Right? Like, so it's a question of like, yeah, you'll have to do this like every time you move to a new location, and you'll have to expand. Like, there was no need for anyone in St.John to learn Bengali when it's unheard of to have a Bengali patient. But then, migration changed and so on and so forth, and like now I understand it's not super uncommon. So yeah, so even if you were here 20 years and knew all the 4 languages, you now have to like learn a 5th language, right? Again, biology is the limitation there, right? It's not stupidity. And I think sometimes doctors are really hard on themselves. They're like, oh my God, I can't just learn this language, and maybe you see someone else who like learned it, and it's like, no, it's just biology, don't worry about it. Like, you're just past your prime, you're old in that sort of way.
I think it also happens in a very informal way, because I remember all the Telugu people got together and they brought out a booklet of questions to ask in medicine and surgery. And it was selling like hotcakes in the mess. Of course, we had to buy them some stuff if they had to hand it over. But it's been passed on, and you, especially as a medicine PG, I remember in the Delhi season, you have the bus from Madanpalli and would come at 4 a.m. And you have to know platelet Tagindi, A1D, and you need to know those words to make those fast conversations. So in some informal ways, it has always been happening. But again, is there a need for a structured way? And it is important, because the connect does happen with patients when you speak to them in their own language. So,
I just want to add first thing to the lot of you. I'm happy to be here. He just mentioned that he arose out of a, sort of a partnership between 1965 batch that's named after Lalit Narayan, 1 year junior to Brain Bias and 2 years junior to Mary. So we're really vintage. Probably most of your parents are not around, probably later on and Thelma, who's 1971 batch. Now I don't want to do that for family, I just want to say, it is striking me that some of us, when I think I'm very involved in medical education, it's always been an area of interest, and now it's gone into community health and so on. But I did a lot of work on medical education here, and I often wondered why language has become maybe a little bit more of a problem than for later batches of St. John's and for us. And only recently, when talking to a lot of my own colleagues of the first 10 batches, we were all trained as St. Martha's Martha's Hospital, St.John. And what I noticed for a long time, I thought it was whether it's the effect of our professors. A lot of our teachers were not academics, they were practitioners. In the first 10 years, they brought anybody who was a good doctor in Bangalore, and we had people from all the different hospitals. We went to different hospitals. But what suddenly struck me only recently after talking since 2017, Tejas is batch, the same batch, the 150 batch. Our center in CHC has been working very closely with Johnite Tales, the Spirit of St. John's project. Some of you may not know, but it's all been very voluntary, but it's coming together because what we found was that we hung out in St. Martha's Hospital from our final year. Okay, now I find hanging out in the hospital, not during clinic times, not during, but hanging out in the evenings and in the afternoons. There's nothing else to do. Bangalore was a very different city, and so we spent a lot of time in the hospital. And then our internship was so different from today, because now we are being clerks, asking for investigations, and maybe we actually, the old days, we first were taught nursing, the first 3 months of clinical. But more important, all interns had to do blood, urine and stool test after OPD, outpatients, so that all the inpatients, for the next day's round. And it wasn't like you just wrote out blood, urine, stool, you did it. So the whole idea of going and getting the blood, urine, stool sample from the patient, you understand? There was a lot of, to think of Department of Medicine, when I tell people they can't believe it, there were 3 of us, at that level. I was an intern, Dr. Ray Pius was my senior house officer, and Dr. Oprah, Professor of Medicine, was our tutor. And we were the 3 basically running the wards. The professors were all practitioners, they were associated with hospitals, they'd come and go. And so we could manage it. Now when I go to a ward in St. John's or any place, it's not a critique of that, it's just that things have got more complicated and so on. There are such a hierarchy of people that has intern. There's a house officer, residents, lecturers, doctors, all sorts of people, and you are not doing very much. So I think hanging out in our time before anthropology and all came in, and the next generation of Johns is lucky to that, was hanging out with the patient meant, and just one little thought I have is, Crystal Medical College, Ludhiana, we did a study on medical education, seeing where are people, how are people doing, and we had a very interesting one, which I think St. John's could even today do, called Samaritan medicine, which was when you're in the first 2 years, before you start hospital work, you invite medical students to go and spend the evenings in the wards. And in every ward, the sisters being told to tell them who are the lonely patients, whose parents are not coming, or children are or family not coming, and what, and you go and spend time with them, much before you start worrying about is their liver like that, or the heart is there, so you're beginning to talk, you're building.
So that sort of thing was continuing here, I'm not sure about right now, but we have posted in medicine different units, even in second year. Our job was to get attached to one bed and follow up that patient right from admission to discharge.
When Dr. Mary came as
correct. So even if as
so my
late as 2009, 2010,
this doesn't have to necessarily mean, in the community you can do it all the time, because you're there, THI, with the nurses and all my diseases. If we did 300 deliveries in 2 years, I don't know, he might have done about 30 in St. John's during his OPG course. And I still remember, because being his parent, he came back quite shocked after the first few months, because he said the day he arrived here, there was another very nice doctor, Dr. Sheshadri. He was from BMC, but he came into research here. They both went as young guys. He was a rural one, and he was not a rural one. They both went together. And the nurses, who were not even trained nurses in the sense of, not even ANMs, here your PSC nurses, came and told them, you see, we'll manage all the normal therapies. When the abnormal one comes, we want you to stop. And they remember he telling me that, Papa, I was so worried, because that's just the opposite of what we did. We did the normal therapies and called so many people for abnormal. And here they said, and next day they found these nurses that they knew. So I think there's also an issue of empathy, which I think can be, and language helps. But I think even before that, if you just hung out with the patients more and more, and as he says, even sit in the ward rather than go and sit in the library, you sort of pick up certain things, We did in Martha's for the first time. I realized that you cannot, the best person to explain to a patient is the ward boy. But I saw, day after day, I saw the professor, Dr. A.G. Krishna, Dr. Nagra, explaining to the patient. They're the best of them, they're really good at that. They explain. But the patient was a bit nervous, here is the senior doctor. As soon as the patient, we all went off on our rounds, some of us interns went back and we found them asking the next patient, what did that doctor say? These old roads, they always say like that. That doctor told me, I know. So he states the diagnosis and the treatment, patient next door, rather than the doctor who's really taken the drug. Here's Professor George D'Souza, medicine telling you, and then this. So this is very important that we build empathy. And I think language is a very, very important. And there are even phrase books from what we are all working on. Maybe to learn 5 years. Talk to each other.